wrap things up here. Again, just a reminder for those of you who haven't been looking, we've got an exam here, May 11th. It'll be over in the Hearst Gym over by Bancroft, 3 to 6 p.m. Scheduled as a 3-hour exam. I don't think you're going to need more than 2 hours for it, but you'll have all 3 hours. First hour is non-cumulative. It'll cover, well, I'll tell you what it covers in a minute. Cover basically stuff since the last midterm. And the second hour will be a cumulative exam that'll give you a chance to put things together a little bit. There were 4 topics since the midterm exam, but because the midterm was a little long, you didn't really get a chance to strut your stuff on social judgment and inference. We'll put that in to the non-cumulative portion as well. And there are lots of resources. We'll have a review session in here, right at this time, next Wednesday, a week from this minute. And the review materials, the new narrative review will be posted by Friday. That's almost finished. And you'll be able to, there are lots of other resources. The lecture illustrations are posted to the course website. Lecture supplements, which take lectures and go in more detail, are also up on the website. They've all been updated. And of course, if you have any questions left over either before or after the review session next week, feel free to post them to the website forum, especially if you can't get to the review session. And any question that's posted by noon on Monday will be answered by the end of business that day, so that we'll all be ready for the exam on Tuesday. Nice thing about the exam on Tuesday is nobody has an opportunity to oversleep, right? So being on at 3 o'clock. Okay, any questions about the exam? Anything at all right now? Yeah. Oh yeah, that'll be just like the last one. And if you look at the exams that are posted to the course website, you'll see what the style is and what the content is. The basic, details vary from year to year, but the thrust of the course remains pretty much the same. So those exams are up there as your study guide and review guide, and you shouldn't expect too much departure from that. Okay, when this whole business started in the early 1950s, Jerome Bruner and Renato Tajuri defined social cognition simply as placing the knowing of people within the context of how we know the environment generally. From this point of view, social cognition is a subset of cognitive psychology, okay? Really what happens here is that what we're looking at first is the role of cognition in social psychology, how cognitive processes mediate social interactions, and then to some extent we want to look at the social psychology of cognition, how those cognitive processes themselves are embedded in a larger social context. But taking off from Bruner and Tajuri, one way to think about this course, not necessarily the best way, but one way to think about this course is that it's a cognitive psychology course where all the topics are social in nature. Just like for those of you who've taken Professor Ivory's Psychology 127, the cognitive neuroscience course, you know that that's basically a cognitive psychology course. He runs through all the topics, except that there's a particular focus on the brain. But the various topics in cognition, perception, memory, thinking, judgment, reasoning, inference, problem solving, the role of language, individual differences in intelligence, the development of cognitive processes, how we develop mathematical and computational models that instantiate theories of cognitive processing, and how all this relates to the brain. This is what you do in any cognitive psychology course. And that's pretty much what we did in this course as well, except that because of the shortened semester, I had to leave out the material on social intelligence. If you're really interested in that, there's material on that topic in the lecture supplements. So in case this is your first time here, That's a review of the course. So let's just kind of try to sum up what we were doing. Okay, first, okay, social cognition is in some sense a subset of cognitive psychology. What we're trying to do is understand how we understand other people, how we know other people, and the basis for that understanding is our understanding of how we know things in general. But I think it's become clear over the semester that there are certain critical differences between social cognition, cognition of social objects, and standard cognition, the cognition of Necker cubes and vases and profiles and word lists and funny little problems that you have to solve with string and candles and matchbooks and all of that. The first is that in the social case, the stimulus environment, the world we're trying to understand is much more ambiguous. The moon is the moon. We don't know whether it's a big moon on the horizon or a moon that just looks bigger on the horizon, but the moon is what it is. But so often in social interaction, the people we're trying to understand, the behaviors we're trying to figure out what's going on, the situations where we're trying to find our place in are very ambiguous. One source of this ambiguity is that the social situation presents us with a whole bunch of cues, some of which may conflict with something else. If somebody says, "I love you," and he's not smiling, or he's kind of looking away, or something like that, you don't know what to make of that. Well, you do know what to make of it, but the fact of the matter is, well, you don't know what to make of it. He could just be shy, or he could be a psychopath, or whatever. But the fact of the matter is the cues are conflicting, and you have to figure out which ones you're going to rely on, how you're going to put all this information together. Moreover, context really matters. If you see two people fighting, it makes a big difference whether you see them fighting on the playground, or in a classroom, or on a stage, or in somebody's backyard. The context in which the behavior takes place tells us a tremendous amount, or at least presents us with cues that might tell us a tremendous amount about the nature of the behavior itself. The next thing to be said is that cognition isn't the only thing that goes on in the mind. Immanuel Kant famously argued that there were three different kinds of mental faculties: cognition, emotion, and motivation. This is a social cognition course, but it's pretty clear that emotion and motivation have a lot to do with social cognition. In the first place, to some extent, our emotional and motivational states are a product of our cognitive processes. When we react to the things that people say or do, emotionally, when we have goals that are being achieved in some kind of context, those reactions, those goals are, to some extent, a product of our appraisal of the situation, our cognitive appraisal of the situation. Figuring out what's going on is part of what's involved in figuring out how to feel and what to want. Now, emotional and motivational processes play a role in non-social cognition as well, but I think it's the case that by any standard, they're just more important for social cognition. The social behavior, social interaction, social relations are inherently emotional and motivational in nature. So then what we have to do, there are just a lot of cues in the social environment that we have to pay attention to, and those cues make a big difference in how we're going to understand what's going on. Social cues can be important in the non-social case too. In the famous Ash conformity experiment, where subjects were just sitting trying to figure out which line was longer than another line, it turned out that there were conformity processes, and people looked to each other for cues when the situation is ambiguous. But again, because the social situation is much more naturally ambiguous than the non-social situation, these social cues are much more important. are a lot of our learning about other people, learning about ourselves, learning about social interaction, takes place in an expressly social context. We're taught an awful lot about what we believe about the world. We learn an awful lot of what we believe we know about the world from observing other people. So yeah, we learn from direct experience, but we also learn from watching other people, and we also learn by being taught by other people. Very important aspect of social cognition. And then finally, I think that you can go a long way in a cognitive psychology course and never really talk about what people do. You can take a perception course and talk about the moon illusion and the Necker cube and the Rubin vase and all those, the color vision and all those things, and never really talk about what people do with those percepts. You can take a memory course like the one I've taught. So this isn't a criticism of anybody in particular. You can take a memory course and it's all about lists of words and paragraphs of stories and things like that without really talking about what people do with their memories, what the role is that memory plays in life, other than the obvious thing, the obvious fact that memory is a precondition for learning. But in social cognition, we're drawn to the basic point that our social behaviors, what we do with each other, what we get out of our interactions with each other, are all a product of cognition. Bruner put it really nicely, and the purpose of all perception is action. The whole point of having a mind is to allow you to engage in adaptive behaviors in a very complicated environment. And the whole point of social cognition is to serve as a basis for social interaction. Now, I call these quantitative differences between social and non-social cognition because these are also properties of the non-social case. It's just that, at least I suspect it is the case, social cognition is even more so. It's more ambiguous. There are more conflicting cues. There's more of a role to be played by emotion and motivation. But the same kinds of principles govern social cognition in these respects as govern non-social cognition. But I do think that there are some qualitative differences, some differences in kind. There's kind of like a quantum leap between the non-social case and the social case in certain kinds of respects. And here are some of them. First, it's entirely possible that social cognition, social cognitive processes are executed by different parts of the brain than non-social processes are. This is a debatable point, but you have to raise it as a possibility based on the findings of social neuropsychology and social neuroscience so far. As I say, it's a debatable point. If you think about something like the face area, the so-called fusiform face area exemplifies the idea that there's some part of the brain that is dedicated to some aspect of social cognition, some part of the brain that just does face perception and face identification. Again, that's not necessarily true, but the argument about the fusiform face area exemplifies this possible qualitative difference. More of a qualitative difference, I think more clearly qualitative difference, is the role of the self in cognition. In non-social cognition, the self is the subject of cognition. I see a chair, I see a computer, I see a GSI, I see students, I see windows and trees outside. I'm doing that. I'm aware of what I see. I'm aware of what I remember. I'm aware of what I'm thinking and wanting and feeling. But in social cognition, one of the things I'm aware of and perceive of and remember things about is myself. So in social cognition, the self is both the subject of cognition, the thing that's doing the cognizing, and it's the object of cognition. It's the thing that's being cognized. And that's a difference, I think, that you can't, I think almost by definition, find in the non-social case. Setting aside the distinction between the self as subject and the self as object, another major difference in between social and non-social cognition has to do with the objects of cognition themselves, which is us. We are the objects of social cognition. You're the objects of my social cognition. I'm, at least for the moment, the object of your social cognition. And the thing that's really interesting about social cognition is that the object of cognition is itself a sentient being, is itself a person who has consciousness, who is aware of of things that are going on, and who, for that matter, is trying to control how we perceive that person. There's this really interesting dynamic relationship between impression formation on the part of the perceiver in social cognition and impression management on the part of the perceived. And we are always, constantly, trying to manage each other's impressions of ourselves. And if you don't think you do this, you're just kidding yourself, because you do. And it's not just when you're meeting somebody for the first time. It's a kind of never-ending project, almost from birth to death. And the perceiver knows this. The perceiver understands, even if they haven't taken a social cognition course, that this is the case, which is why one of the things we do is to learn to read between the lines, to try to get behind the objects or the target's impression management strategies and try to figure out what he or she is really like. Of course, the object of perception knows you're trying to do that too, so it kind of goes back and forth a while. But in the non-social case, you'll hardly ever encounter objects of perception that are themselves sentient. Let's not get into an argument about tigers and snakes and things like that. But the fact of the matter is there's a qualitative difference between our minds and the minds of even the smartest chimpanzee. And that makes a qualitative difference between social and non-social cognition. And then finally, a problem that I introduced a little bit last time is the observer dependence of so much of social cognition. In the non-social case, we can pretty much assume that the objects that we're trying to understand, what we're trying to perceive and remember and think about, exist independent of our own minds. But when it comes to the social case, you don't have that assumption as a safe assumption anymore. In the first place, your perception of the person is itself a construction. It's something that you're building up in your head. You're making inferences. You're filling in the gaps. You're trying to figure out what's going on. In that sense, what you're responding to is not independent of your own mind. And in a larger sense, there is a very large part of social reality that is itself a social construction. It's a product of minds working together and creating a reality that is what it is simply because people agree that it's that way. Creating a reality that is what it is by virtue of the fact that there are observers in it. The moon's the moon whether we're here or not. The solar system is the solar system whether we're here or not. But it's not clear that extroversion and neuroticism and agreeableness and conscientiousness and gender roles and race relations and things like that would be here in quite the way that they're here if there were not people who were here to build up that reality. So there are some quantitative differences, and then there are these kinds of qualitative differences that seem to make social cognition not just something you can make a chapter in a cognitive psych book, kind of tack it on, but something that really requires more fundamental study. Okay, so the question then, the question is social cognition anything special? The answer is, well, yeah, kind of, sort of. And again, this is really what captures what's special about social cognition. In the non-social case, we can assume that the objects of cognition have an independent existence, and they are, except for the occasional lion, tiger, and bear, not sentient beings. But in the social case, we have to deal with the fact that the objects of cognition have minds of their own. They're trying to understand us. They're trying to shape our understandings at the same time as we're trying to understand them, and we're trying to get behind their impression management strategies. And then we have to always deal with the fact that the categories that guide social cognition are, to at least some extent, products of our own minds. They don't exist independently of our own minds either. And so we have to always be asking ourselves, is this really true? Or am I making it true by my behavior? Is it really true, or do I just think it's true because of my expectations or whatever? So in that respect, we can say social cognition is, to some extent at least, special. And again, just to kind of put this another way, in social cognition, more than any place else, in social cognition, beliefs can create realities. Beliefs aren't just about reality. Beliefs create, to some extent, the reality that they're about through things like the self-fulfilling prophecy, expectancy confirmation processes, behavioral confirmation, perceptual confirmation, all of that stuff, and also through the social construction of reality, by which we can create an objective reality, a reality of money and marriage and property rights and things like that, mostly through mental activity, through shared beliefs. This theme of the relationship between social and non-social cognition is kind of captured in a debate that arose in the 1980s and is still with us now about which came first, okay? The social or the non-social case. Tom Ostrom, who is a pioneering theorist in social cognition at Ohio State University, argued very forcefully in a series of papers that, in fact, social cognition came first, that somehow non-social cognition is derived from social cognition. And he made the argument pretty much the same way, pretty much this way. He said, look, the primary fact about human beings is that we're social creatures. Before anything else, above and beyond anything else, we're social creatures. We live in groups. We interact with each other, interactions that have a quality of cooperation and competition. We mate for life, more or less. We tend our young, more or less. We pass on from one generation to another a set of a culture and a kind of social history so that they don't have to kind of reinvent the wheel every time a new generation comes along. There's something that is kind of irreducibly and fundamentally social about human nature, which lends support to the idea that maybe social cognition is primary with us and that non-social cognition is somehow derivative. Ostrom makes the point that children tend to think animistically. They tend to think that objects, not just puppets, but oatmeal containers and balls and so on, that have minds, that they have goals, that there are things that they want to do, make attributions of intentionality, that is, that objects have goals and motives, and that we kind of generalize as children from the social case to the non-social case. If we generalize from the non-social case to the social case, we wouldn't make this mistake, is his point, because we understand that rocks and oatmeal containers don't have goals and motives, and then we try to figure out later that we do. But we do make that mistake, which suggests that the social comes first, and that later on, what kids do is to learn to make the differences between animate objects and inanimate objects, and animate objects that can have goals and beliefs of their own, and those that don't. So that's basically that point. And Ostrom also points out that for us anyway, for us as humans, our important behaviors are all social in nature. Okay? That the things we do in our lives, the vast bulk of our behavior is social behavior. in a way, he argued anyway. This is not true for even other animate objects. Don't engage in the kind of constant stream of social behavior that we engage in. So we've got this cognitive mediation of social behavior, and most important for us humans, we have language, which serves both as a tool for thinking, linguistic representations being really important aspects of thought, but also language as a vehicle for communicating our beliefs and our desires and our feelings to other people. We're built for social interaction. And we're built for social interaction not least because we've got a capacity for language that nobody else has, and that's just another a point, I think, for Ostrom's idea that the social came first and the non-social came afterwards, at least as far as we're concerned. Keith Holyoake and Peter Gordon, responding in some respects to Ostrom's point, cited a book which I don't think anybody reads anymore, but which was on my freshman college reading list, C.P. Snow's The Two Cultures. You have to be in a particular generation, I think, to read this book. It's a pretty good book. Who argued, Snow argued that the sciences and the humanities represented two cultures that had relatively little contact with each other, and he thought that was kind of a bad idea. Holyoake and Gordon, taking off from this, argued that social and non-social cognition to some extent represented two cultures within psychology and cognitive science that typically had relatively little to do with each other. They offered what I think is a kind of interesting anthropological analogy to what happens when two cultures come together, whether it's Columbus encountering the Taino Indians or European Jesuit priests encountering the Chinese, or Stanley and Livingston going into Africa, that what happens when two cultures come together is that it might be the case that one culture will dominate the other one temporarily, but these things kind of change from time to time as well, so that one culture dominates at one point, the other culture dominates at another point. And Holyoake and Gordon argued that something like that happens in the relations between social and non-social cognition. At some point, sometimes social cognition seems to be really derivative of non-social cognition. Sometimes social cognition encounters a phenomenon or a principle that makes the non-social types look up from their books and pay attention. But also, he pointed out that in anthropology, when two cultures meet, they don't just meet and interact, and one dominates and the other one doesn't, and then they shift the positions, but that each culture reconstructs the other one. Each culture takes the other one and kind of and influences it in various ways, and that each culture learns from the other one as well. And that's a more positive aspect of this relationship between social and non-social cognition. Holyoake and Gordon didn't know anything about social neuroscience when they were writing in 1984, but you might begin to think about neuroscience as reflecting a third culture in this interplay of fields where people whose primary focus is on the brain and the rest of the nervous system and the rest of biology, for that matter, are also engaged in this process of cultural exchange. Sometimes neuroscience is deriving its methods and its principles and its concepts directly from psychology or other aspects of cognitive science. At other times, neuroscience says, hey, look, you look at the brain, you learn something new. That's a negotiation here. But now we've got 3 points engaged in interaction, not just social and non-social cognition, but we've got cognitive and social neuroscience as well. And again, in the same way that each culture can kind of temporarily dominate, right now I think we're looking at a kind of struggle for dominance involving cognitive neuroscience. Is neuroscience going to be the queen of the behavioral sciences, or the king of the behavioral sciences that will succeed in a program to kind of reduce all the other sciences, all the other behavioral sciences, to principles of the principles of brain function. That's a goal for some neuroscientists. I can name names if you wanted, but I won't. Paul and Patricia Churchland, Steve Stitch, people like that. And we'll see kind of how that works out over the years. Okay. John Searle makes the very interesting point that one of the reasons that we have this kind of interaction between these two kinds of sciences is that we've got two different kinds of reality which are trying to be understood by two different kinds of sciences. The first kind of reality is what Searle calls an intrinsic reality, the properties of things and the mechanics by which they interact with each other that would be true even if there was nobody there to observe them. Intrinsic facts about the world, which Searle argues are the proper subject of the natural sciences like physics and chemistry and biology and cosmology and so on. And then there's this other kind of reality, which is this personal and social reality that is what it is only because there are people in it. Social reality, personal reality that is what it is only because there are observers who create that particular reality. And Searle argues that it's that observer-dependent reality, the reality of people interacting, of societies interacting, of political campaigns, of economic laws, things like that, the reality of history, that is the proper subject of the social sciences. And here I think you have another take on the two cultures problem. Do the natural sciences and the social sciences constitute two cultures that don't really talk to each other very much? When they do interact, do they have all sorts of problematic relations, problems of dominance or whatever? That's something I think is just something for us to understand in the future. Okay. The last point to be made, I think, is that social cognition can serve as a basis for creating a kind of cognitive point of view in social science generally. It's pretty clear to me, anyway, that social cognition provides the theoretical concepts for social neuroscience. I'm not so much interested in connecting things down at the moment, but it seems to me that the study of social cognition forms a basis for infusing the other social sciences with what might be called the cognitive point of view, a point of view that is focused on problems of knowledge and knowing and perception and all of that. It's not my idea, it's Mark Turner's idea. Turner's a Berkeley PhD, worked with George Lakoff, who points out that the kinds of things that social sciences are interested in are all cognitive kinds of things. The social sciences, this is Searle's point as well, are really fundamentally concerned with problems of meaning. They're interested in how people reason. They're interested in how people make choices or how societies make choices. They're interested in how individuals and groups categorize the world. Social sciences are not interested in so much interested in biological evolution as they are in cultural evolution. Cultural evolution, the transmission of knowledge from one generation to the next, and the way that knowledge changes from one generation to the next. And they're also interested in cultural differences, which are essentially differences in knowledge and belief. These are all topics about cognition, all topics that have to do with knowledge and knowing. And so what you might begin to think about is how the perspective of social cognition could serve as a basis for a kind of cognitive revolution, not just in psychology, that's over, we had that, but a cognitive revolution in the other social sciences as well, to get sociologists to think about the cognitive basis of group interactions, for example, or social structure, to get historians to think about intergroup conflict as conflicts about ideas, to think about historical change as in terms of changes in belief. So it seems to me that in the final analysis, what we got to do is just kind of think about this. In order to understand social cognition, we have to understand not just what goes on inside the individual. Okay, we're trying to link psychology and cognitive science to other kinds of things. In social cognition, the individual is trying to understand the social world, but the individual is not separate from that social world. He or she is part and parcel of that social world. So if we're going to understand how the individual thinks, we also have to understand how those social forces play out in that individual's life. And I think that's not just a job for psychology. That's a job that enrolls all of the social sciences, sociology and anthropology and political science and history and economics and all the other social sciences as well, which suggests that it really might be time for the social sciences to become more closely involved in the project of cognitive science, for example, and it's time for the cognitive point of view to kind of get involved with some of these other social sciences. Okay, so social cognition is not just the embedding of the knowing of people inside a science of how we know things generally. I think that the study of social cognition really is the first step towards that thoroughly cognitive social science that people like Mark Turner and, for that matter, George Lakoff talk about. Because what we have to understand is that cognition in all its forms, cognition in general, but especially social cognition, is not just a matter of individual minds knowing the world. So there's a social context for social cognition, which reflects the fact that in social cognition, there are individual minds working together to know the world. And for that matter, trying to understand a reality that is at least in large part the products of their own minds working together. So through individual and collective cognitive processes, we try to understand the world in which we find ourselves, but one of the things we understand is that we're simultaneously making the world in which we find ourselves, making the world we're trying to understand. There's a lot more to social cognition than that, but that's the end of the semester, so that's all we can do. Thank you very much. You've been a really nice class. I've enjoyed this. I hope you have as well. And for those of you who are not graduating, don't be strangers, okay? And for those of you who are, have a wonderful life, okay? Thanks very much. We'll see you next Wednesday for the review session and the Tuesday thereafter for the final exam.